Welcome and shalom to our seminar as part of the Australia-Israel Scholars Seminar Series. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people as their traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. I pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. My name's Jo Saville. I'm based at the University of Queensland, and today we are joined by staff and students from the University of Queensland and other universities across Australia and New Zealand. I'm thrilled to welcome Liat Ayalon, who is a professor in the School of Social Work at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Professor Ayalon is currently funded by the Israel Science Foundation to study intergenerational relations in the context of climate change. She consults both national and international organizations concerning the development and evaluation of programs and services for older adults. In recognition of her work, Professor Ayalon was selected by the UN Decade of Healthy Aging as one of 50 world leaders working to transform the world to be a better place in which to grow older. Today, Liat will be presenting on addressing ageism towards a world of all ages. So I thank you and welcome, Liat.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here virtually. I'm happy to talk today and talk about ageism and how we should be addressing it towards a world for all ages. Ageism is defined as stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And today I will be talking briefly about the definition of ageism, why it matters, and ways to reduce ageism. And then I will conclude with a couple of policy and research recommendations. So as I said, ageism is defined as stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And actually, it can be directed towards people of all age groups, towards young and old, and it can be positive or negative. However, in this particular talk, I will be talking about the negative aspects of ageism as they are being directed towards older people, because I am from the field of gerontology, and actually most of the research has been conducted with regard to older people and the negative impact of ageism on their lives. And I picked up a couple of examples. The first one is from the pandemic. And the pandemic of COVID was also a pandemic of ageism, basically. And I think that we saw it very clearly in the communication, which equated vulnerability and risk with chronological age. And this was true medically, but it turned older people into a homogeneous, vulnerable population. And many policies, such as lockdown and access and triage, were all based on chronological age in an arbitrary way, and therefore were ageist and increased ageism towards older people. Same goes with the neglect of long-term care institution, which has been all along, but was very prominent during the pandemic. And I think that with vaccination in many countries, we actually saw the reverse ageism. It was positive aspects of ageism, giving older people the right to go, and it was justified medically. But this, again, has an ageist basis to it, because it's the preference of older versus younger people based on their chronological age. We also see ageism in technology, and I picked up one example for that, and that's an example from Google Autocomplete. And basically, when we are searching for things over Google, it automatically completes our search. When we try to see how it completes searches concerning older men versus women, we found that in general, the terms used and the questions identified and brought up to the forefront by Google are quite negative. Again, this is illustrative of the queries that people make on Google, but it's also a product of what Google technicians have worked out as the first terms that come up. And what we found was a difference between descriptions of older men versus older women, with men having less derogatory terms used towards them, whereas women were referred to in pretty derogatory terms. And also the queries, the questions that people asked or that Google automatically completed with regard to men and women were quite different. So this is just another illustration of how ageism meets us in our everyday life. The third example is the climate change situation. And actually, I became interested in the climate change question altogether as a result of the discourse that I've heard with regard to older people as being responsible to the climate change. We know that the climate change is a major threat to our well-being and human rights, and it affects our access to clean air, to water, to food supply, and to adequate shelter. With regard to older people, they are particularly susceptible to the effects of climate change, especially physically and also in terms of higher risk for mortality as a result of climate events. So it's really considered a risk for human rights of older people. However, as I started, the discourse around climate change and climate change activism is quite conflictual sometimes. And here I'm illustrating this based on a study that we conducted that reviewed 60 activists and their discussion of responsibility for the current situation, responsibility for fixing the situation. And what we found was that in general, younger activists were more likely to use terms that provoked intergenerational tension, blaming the older generation for not doing enough and for bringing us to this situation. Older generations, on the other hand, were more likely to advocate for intergenerational solidarity. They took the responsibility for the current situation, but they also view themselves as responsible for trying to amend and ensure a better future for the younger generation. Interestingly enough, and this is a study actually that was conducted in Australia that looked at lay people's perceptions concerning intergenerational responsibility in the context of climate change. What we found was that older people were less likely to think that it is their fault and they're the ones who are responsible for the mess. However, they were seeing themselves as more caring, as the one who really are responsible and care about the current situation. And they also, older people also, were less likely to think that it's a matter of age groups. Younger people, on the other hand, were more likely to blame older people, less likely to think that older people cared about the environment, and were more likely to think that it's a matter of age. So I think that this really is illustrative how there is some intergenerational tension coming from younger generation towards older generation, holding them responsible for the current situation, not only in policy discourse, in activist discourse, but also in lay people perceptions. And I think that at least parts of the vulnerability of older people in the context of climate change can be attributed to ageism. Ageism prevents older people from being part of the climate change movement to a certain degree. It also can result in older people internalizing negative messages and viewing themselves as responsible, viewing themselves as inadequate, and this can be a form of self-ageism. We also know that in many policy measures, at least up until recently, older people, even though they are a susceptible population, were not included in these policy documents. And this is another form actually of ageism, the exclusion of older people from the discourse. So this is really something that we have to address in future policy. To understand age and ageism, I think that it's important to look at the intersection of age with various attributes. And I showed here only the intersection of age with gender. But age is never age alone. It's always age in intersection with other characteristics that make people more or less vulnerable. Same goes for ageism in different contexts. It manifests differently. It has different implications in different contexts. And today I just illustrated 3 different contexts in which ageism takes place, but it takes place in a variety of other contexts. in terms of what we should do, we should definitely use techniques that are already proven. And we know that education about ageism and intergenerational contact are two techniques that are quite helpful and can really reduce ageism. We also know that policy can be effective. So these are the three tools that were identified by the UN Global Report on Ageism. And I think that these are the three tools that we should be using: laws and regulation, education, and intergenerational tension. For more information, you're welcome to check out our website, A Site for All Ages, that has a lot of information about ageism. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liat. That was really fascinating. We have a couple of people on the line, so I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and I'll invite you to ask questions. So Yoni Nazarathi, would you like to ask a question of Liat?
Yes, hi Liat. Thanks a lot. And listen, I came very late. Sorry about that. So I might have missed, I missed a few bits. There's something that I don't know if you touched it on the start, and it's of interest to me. So different cultures, I've lived in a few places around the world, and I saw that in some places an age is a very personal thing, whereas in other places it's open, everybody knows your age, it's certainly part of your CV, etc. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, I think that you're totally right. I know that in South Korea, for instance, when you're meeting people, you have to tell them your age, and based on that, you're being referred to in different ways. Whereas, for instance, I know that in Germany, you're not allowed even to put your date of birth, and people are not allowed to ask for that because it's discriminatory. Is it helpful or not? I'm not sure, because I think that ageism is a universal. We know that ageism is a universal phenomenon, but it does occur actually differently from what we would expect. And research has shown that it is the developing world that is more ageist than developed world. So even though our perception is that you would see higher levels of ageism in more industrialized Western countries, this is the opposite. So maybe it is helpful.
Interesting.
Now that you're,
I would have also thought, okay.
And the arguments are that maybe in societies, like in the developed world, people, because of a tendency towards more individualistic culture, actually people are more willing to accept vulnerability, and they're okay with older people also being vulnerable. Another explanation is that actually in the developing world, the society is aging in at a very rapid pace, and this is bringing a lot of stress into the system and is causing more ageism towards older people. So it's happening everywhere, but at different levels, and it shows differently.
Yeah, thanks.
Liat, you mentioned a couple of items, one around COVID and then climate change. Have you been investigating the digital ageism that exists, in that access to services and things rely so much on technology that is not necessarily helpful for people of older generation?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I have a colleague that works at a bank and actually is responsible for turning everything into digitalized services. And she was saying that the people at the bank are saying, oh, it's a problem of older people of today, the fact that we are digitalizing. It's not going to be a problem of the future generations. But this is actually wrong, I assume, because I think that technology is changing so fast that technology of today that might be obvious and easy for me to handle is not going to be the same in 30 years. So in 30 years, I will be having problems as well with technology. And this is certainly ageist, and there have been films about how older people get lost in the digital world. And they get lost, A, because they're not natives, but there is a good chance that we will not be natives in 30 years with whatever technology comes up. And B, because of sensory decline, which is a natural part of aging.
And I was really interested in the interventions that you mentioned with education, intergenerational contact, and policy. Just around the intergenerational contact, have you seen any particular programs in Israel or around the world that have been really effective in addressing this?
Yeah, well, I actually kind of skipped a couple of slides because I thought that I should stick to like a short presentation. In terms of intergenerational programs, I think that what helps is that older and younger people are on an equal basis, actually. And the problem is that many intergenerational programs try to help older people, but this is not helping, actually. Because if someone is at the helper position and the other one is being helped, then we have a power difference that is maintained and actually might increase ageism. So in order to really reduce ageism, we have to bring people at equal footing and really make sure that both groups can contribute to whatever activity is being done. And it needs to be done in a collaborative way rather than competition against each other. I can tell you that right now we are trying to develop, it's a complex intergenerational intervention. We're trying to develop an intervention with social robots that will ask younger and older people who are seated together different interactive questions and offer them different activities to make both parties engaged in some type of conversation. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So you said robots, social
robots?
Social
robots. And well, it's like really science fiction because we're also looking at their brainwaves. So we're looking at the brainwaves of the older and younger people to make sure that they are being synchronized. And the idea that through synchronization of brainwaves and the social robots, we can overcome ageism and bring the parties together. But the technology is so complex there that half the time we are working on the technology and we haven't really figured out how to move to the next stage of really overcoming ageism. I think that the truth is that this project really aimed to bring together researchers from different disciplines, and that's why it's so sophisticated. We have an engineer who is building the social robots, and we have a brain scientist who is doing the synchronization. But my impression is that many times to get an effective intervention in the field, in the social field, what you need to do is like social research. And we're doing some of this as well. So this is really complex and innovative and exciting. But to get the results, you can get that easily with other less sophisticated means, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Amazing. Yeah, in Australia, there's some popular TV shows where they're bringing people from old people's homes together with school kids or kindergartens and having interactions there. And the libraries in Australia are running human libraries where people are conversing across age groups and experiences. So it feels like society is trying to do a few things, but we could do so much better.
I agree. I skipped this part in my presentation, but I think that the first thing that we really have to be doing is to introduce the term ageism to people. And maybe in Australia, because it's an English-speaking country, people are familiar with the term. But in Israel, even though I'm in the field of gerontology, I became familiar with the term maybe 10 years ago and not before that. And I think that until you are familiar with the term, you really don't know what to do with it. So I remember when I used the term in English, I devoted maybe 10 minutes of my class to the topic of ageism, and that's it. And now that I have the term in Hebrew, I could devote an entire class or an entire semester to the topic of ageism because it finally sinks in my brain to really understand what it means. And in a study that we did, we found that when people are just asked, have you experienced ageism, without defining it properly to them, very few would confess to experience it. But once it's being defined, then people say, yes, I've experienced it. And I assume that the same goes for, yes, I'm doing that. I am being ageist. So I would say the first thing is really to make sure that people understand what it is. That's the first tool, and it's not so complex even. You don't need to bring people together. Just tell them what it is as a starting point, like, because everyone knows what racism is, what sexism is, but ageism is just less in our lexicon, less in our mind that we are being ageist. So
interesting. Yoni, do you have any further questions?
Yeah, I'll ask one more. I must say, I'm also looking at your website, the psychological aspects of Aging Research Lab. I'll certainly watch some of those videos as well as this recording. I was wondering of just the interaction of gender or sex and ageism, because I think today in 2024 we're witnessing the passing phenomena of trying to, little by little, the world has become a bit more gender balanced, but still far from it, right? So for example, in my School of Mathematics and Physics at UQ, we have just about 25% female academics, right? But there's a progress to make it near or at 50%, and it'll probably take a decade or two more. So if you're doing research on ageism now, and there's this transient phenomena in gender balance, how does that impact your research? Because gender is probably a key component.
Well, it's a key component, but I think that just like with culture, it's behaving, well, somewhat in opposition to what we would be thinking. And actually, it's older men many times who are being hurt the most, because they are seen as a threat to the younger generation. And there is research to show that people are more willing to hire, hypothetically, an older woman versus an older man, or are more likely to like this older woman versus an older man, because older men are the ones who've had all the power for a long time.
Yeah.
And now they're being expected to give up this power.
Interesting. Okay, I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yes. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Liat, for this really thought-provoking talk. It's been wonderful to host you, and we greatly appreciate your sharing your research with us. And I think big thank you to all the participants here today and our future YouTube viewers. So we're holding these seminars twice a week as part of the Australia-Israel Scholars Seminars. So please get in touch if you would like to speak at a future event or attend our future events. So thank you very much.
Thank you for organizing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That can be the end of the recording.